Saw an interesting thing last night on television. This was actually on MSNBC. I think it was on Chris Hayes' show. And it was a super PAC ad. And it was a Republican super PAC ad, which is really interesting. It's a group called Future 45. It's funded by Paul Singer and the Ricketts family. My recollection is, well, actually, I shouldn't say who specifically Paul Singer and the Ricketts family. I think the Ricketts family is supporting the Texas governor, wasn't it, Rick Perry? And Paul Singer, I don't know if he's endorsed a Republican or not, but in any house, Paul Singer is the multi-billionaire Wall Street guy that Greg Palast writes a lot about. And so anyhow, the ad was attacking Bernie Sanders, which I found fascinating, for wanting to have a national health care system, for wanting to raise taxes on rich people. Well, actually, for wanting to have a national health care system for... Oh, you have the ad? Oh. Well, let's just play the ad. Here is the ad.
Stagnant incomes, prices rising, a weak economy. What's Bernie Sanders' answer? A $15 minimum wage that hurts small businesses. Higher taxes on banks and corporations that will kill jobs across the country. And free college and health care for all. And just how would he pay for it?
But just to be clear, you are going to raise taxes to do this.
Yes, we will raise taxes. Yes, we will.
Future 45 is responsible for the content of this advertising.
So there's the ad. Now, what's interesting is, what do we make of this and where do we go with this? The Priorities USA Action Super PAC, which is a super PAC that supports Hillary Clinton, has come out and said this is an attempt on the part of Ricketts and Paul Singer to do a double reverse like Claire McCaskill did with legitimate Todd Aiken, Mr. Legitimate Rape, where she actually ran ads saying Todd Aiken is too conservative for Missouri. He supports, ending abortion altogether. And it looked like an attack ad, but what it did was it riled up the pro-Paul Aiken people, and they went out and they voted for Paul Aiken, and she got the opponent that she wanted so she could beat him because he was easy to beat. And Claire McCaskill, sure enough, is in the Missouri Senate, or is in the United States Senate now, representing Missouri. So the Hillary Super PAC is saying that that's why they're running the ad. And Steve Bannon, one of Rachel Maddow's producers, wrote an op-ed saying, this is certainly what it is. And it probably is. You could argue that it's actually an attempt to take down Bernie and promote Hillary, but I doubt it because of the language in the ad. Okay, I think because of the language in the ad that, it's supposed to get people who are more inclined to be supporters of Bernie than Hillary, but generally good Democrats. And I would say that I fall in that category, right? I prefer Bernie over Hillary, but I would vote for either one of them in a heartbeat, and I would work very hard for either one of them to become president of the United States. The stakes are really high, and they're both, I think, reasonably good candidates, but they do represent somewhat of a difference. Actually, where I wanted to go with this is we'll see if they represent somewhat of a difference. But let me get back to this topic first. Back in 1980, politics was not this Machiavellian in the United States, or if it was, we didn't know it, and there was no social media and there was no internet to reveal it to us. And there were a lot of us, myself included, in 1980, who were looking at the candidacy of Ronald Reagan, saying, yes, please make him the nominee. He's the guy. Walter Mondale will, as I recall, it was Mondale. No, it was, who ran against Reagan? Carter, that's right. Oh, yeah, Jimmy Carter had been president. So it was Carter, would be easily able to beat Reagan because Reagan's such a crackpot. I mean, we really believe that Reagan was a crackpot and there's no way he'd win. But Thomas Piketty wrote a fascinating piece for Le Monde, the French newspaper / magazine, whatever it is, in which he suggests, in fact, he says that we're actually entering a new era. That we have, and you've heard me say this many times, that we had this era, we had an era of unrestricted libertarian conservatism in the United States from 1921 with the election of Warren Harding until 1933 with the inauguration of Franklin Roosevelt. And during that period of time, Harding and Coolidge and Hoover reduced regulations, massively lowered taxes from 91% down to 25%. 25%. It was 28% that Reagan took it to. And the top tax rate. And the result was, what looked like a booming economy. Wall Street just exploded and housing values exploded, which was a real mess, actually, for the average working person. I mean, it threw average working people into poverty. But the people at the top were making out like bandits, which is why it was called the Roaring Twenties, because they were so conspicuous in their consumption. Christopher Freeland wrote an absolutely brilliant book about this, about the plutocrats. And she opens the book with this story. So that era came to an end. I mean, I could dial us all the way back to the founding of the Republic and go through how we've switched back, and it's basically been one or two generations. Every one or two generations, we've switched back and forth between this kind of libertarian worldview of how the country should be run, particularly economically, and this more liberal worldview of how the country should be run. So the crash happened in 32, or the crash happened in 29. It got really bad in 30. It got really, really bad in 31. And by 32, it was obvious this was like the point of no return. And thus, FDR got elected and came in 33 and started the New Deal. And the New Deal era lasted until 1980. And then Reagan came in and said, government is not your friend. Government is your enemy. And basically the same argument that Warren Harding ran on in 1920 and won. And Reagan ran on this argument and won. And he lowered taxes, he cut regulation, and actually the economy crashed at first. We had the worst stock market crash since the Great Depression. Unemployment went up to 11%. Inflation was already on the way down because of steps that Jimmy Carter had made and the Federal Reserve chief at that time had made. But we have been in this era of Reaganomics basically from then until now. And so what Thomas Piketty, and just if the name sounds familiar but you don't remember why, he's the guy who wrote this book I think it was called Capital. And basically it was a book asserting that if we don't have a productive economy, if we don't do manufacturing, if we don't go back to what works, we're basically screwed. The financialization of the economy, massive inequality is going to ruin the economy. Really, really rich people think they've got it great, but look out. If you don't bring everybody along with you, there's a cliff ahead of you. And Piketty, in fact, what Piketty said is, because he's facing the Clinton machine as well as the conservatism of mainstream media, Bernie Sanders might not win the race. Very true. But it has been demonstrated that another Sanders, perhaps younger and less white, could one day soon win the U.S. presidential elections and change the face of the country. In many respects, we are witnessing the end of the political ideological cycle opened by the victory of Ronald Reagan in the 1980 elections. And then he basically lays out the argument that I just did. I'll continue this right after this break. This is a fast, and I haven't even gotten to my point yet. Hey, stick around.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Okay, so as I was saying, and I'm just FYI for those of you on hold, I notice all our lines are filled up already. This is going to be a rather extended rant, so it may be 20 minutes or so before we get to phone calls. But Piketty points out, and this is one of the greatest economic thinkers in the world, in my opinion. He points out from 1930 to 1980, for half a century, the rate on the highest U.S. income, over $1 million a year, was on average 82%. This is the tax rate. With peaks of 91% from the 1940s to the 1960s. That's Roosevelt to Kennedy. And as high as 70% during Reagan's election in 1980. This is Thomas Piketty writing in Le Monde. This policy in no way affected the strong growth of the post-war American economy. Okay, so according to one of the world's leading economists, high tax rates on very wealthy people on income over $1 million a year in today's dollars had no effect on slowing down the American economy. He says, and he points out, he says, doubtless because there's not much point in paying super managers $10 million when $1 million will do. He said the estate tax, which was equally progressive with rates applicable to the greatest fortunes in the range of 70 to 80% for decades, greatly reduced the concentration of American capital without the destruction and wars which Europe had to face. And he says all this was carried through almost without unemployment, since the level of productivity and the education system allowed it. Keep in mind, from the FDR era until Reagan, college was functionally free in the United States, or cheap enough that anybody could work a summer job and pay. And my mom worked as a life. She went through 4 years at MSU, graduated summa cum laude in the late 1940s, and did it, paid for it. Her mother was the city clerk of Charlevoix, Michigan. I mean, she had no money. Her dad died when she was 13 years old, my mother. And she paid for it working as a lifeguard during the summer in Charlevoix. And on weekends, when she was in East Lansing, propping and washing airplanes out at the Lansing airport. It's a part-time job. So anyhow, Piketty says all this change, and he's talking about the FDR era, basically 1932 to 1980. He says all this change sparked a muscular opposition, particularly among the financial elites and the reactionary fringe of the white electorate. The culmination of this new program was the tax reform of 1986, which ended half a century progressive tax system and lowered the rate applicable to the highest incomes down to 28%. And then he says Democrats never truly challenged this choice in the Clinton or Obama years, which stabilized the taxation rate at around 40%, which is 2 times lower than the average level from the period of 1930 to 1980. This triggered an explosion of inequality, coupled with incredibly high salaries for those who could get them, as well as stagnation of revenues for most of America. And this was, brought to you by the Republican Party, and the Democrats were not able to reverse it, basically, is the essence of what he's saying. He says, meanwhile, the Republican Party sinks into hyper-nationalism. He says, in summary, Piketty says, however, new forms of political mobilization and crowdfunding can prevail and push America into a new political cycle. We are far from gloomy prophecies about the end of history. Yes, I agree with Piketty. And there's a whole bunch of other pieces that kind of play into this. For example, John Harwood, writing in the New York Times, a headline, "A Warning on the Federal Reserve's Limits." He says, now the bad news, the Fed may have reached the end of its ability to steer the economy and it requires help from Congress. So it's like this idea that a financialized economy is a great way to go. That this is just, hey, let the banks be twice as large as they were before. Let the banks run. Let's just go full tilt bore with this. This is something that's going to be, I just don't think it's going to work out the way that they think that it's going to work out. So what was it like when we had an era where the president was actually calling for higher taxes and the American people were actually responding? Here is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Actually, I've got 8 clips here I'm going to share with you over probably the next 10 minutes of FDR talking about this topic. These are all from the same speech in 1936. This is October 21st, 1936.
In the barrage that we laid down against the Depression, we could not stop firing to haggle about the price of every shell. We kept on firing and fighting. And the important thing is that the war is being won.
So he starts out by kind of basically bragging that we're winning the Great Depression.
A number of my friends who belong in these very high upper brackets have suggested to me on several occasions of late that if I am re-elected president, they will have to move to some other nation because of high taxes here.
Uh-oh.
Now, I will miss them very much. But if they do go, they will soon come back. because a year or two of paying taxes in almost any other country in the world will make them yearn once more for the good old taxes of the USA.
So that's FDR, and essentially calling these folks out. We'll be back right after this break.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-536-2370.
Keep in mind, this was October 21st. This was 2 weeks before the election of 36. And he's campaigning on raising taxes. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. So let me just lay out my premise once again very, very quickly. My premise is that America is at a turning point. I think that we hit this turning point in 2008 with the market crash. I think that we got pregnant with this turning point in 2001 with George W. Bush's response to 9/11. But I think it's been growing for the last 35 years, the years that Reaganomics has been ripping apart the American middle class. I mean, I remember 30 years ago, we say, Reagan is going to drop taxes on rich people. Well, what good is that going to do? Well, maybe it'll work. Well, okay, let's go on. Let's see what happens. Well, now we know. And I think it's not only obvious to average people, it's obvious to the elites as well. And that's, by the way, that's one of the reasons why I have said over and over and over again that whether it's Hillary or whether it's Bernie, Bernie's going to go after this head first. He's campaigning as FDR essentially. But I can't imagine that any Democrat, including Hillary Clinton, could become president now and not have to deal with the force of this change that is coming. And I've made this point many, many times on this program. FDR did not campaign as the FDR that we know from history. FDR campaigned as, I'm the guy, I was Secretary of the Navy, I was governor of New York, I know what I'm doing, I'm very qualified for the job, you should elect me, I know how the power works in this country. He was the governor of New York State, right? And he became FDR because of the times. So I want to make it very clear, I am talking more about the times than about the candidates. Because I believe in my heart of hearts, really, that even if Hillary Clinton were elected, and I think that there's a good chance she will be, even if Hillary Clinton were elected and said, I'm going to just continue the Obama presidency, we're not going to roll back Reaganism. I don't think it would hold. I think that she or any other Democrat would be pretty much forced by the times, if not by a crash. I mean, this is the argument that I make in my book, The Crash of 2016. By the economy, to go back to what actually worked in America. So let's go back and look at this was the birth of that era. This was the beginning of the most recent time. 1936, Franklin Roosevelt is running for re-election as president of the United States. For 4 years, he's been doing the New Deal. He has taken us from 35% unemployment or 33% unemployment. There are dueling numbers because they didn't do statistics all that, analysis all that well back then, down to somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 or 12% unemployment. That was dramatic. Now, after the election of 36 and 37, he started dialing back the New Deal, and unemployment immediately jumped up 2 or 3 points. And then he put the New Deal back into place. And then, of course, World War II, the ultimate big government stimulus program. But in any case, this is FDR campaigning. This is 2 weeks before the election of 1936. The first president to talk like this since the Republican Teddy Roosevelt talked like this in 1901. So, speaking of those cycles. So here again, just a few clips of FDR talking about taxes. But understand that there's a much larger issue here than just taxes. The much larger issue is, how do we want to form this economy? Do we want to form the economy along the lines of the old and new Republican Party, the Warren Harding Republican Party, or I don't care if it's Donald Trump or if it's, Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz Republican, or Jeb Bush for that matter? Do we want to, maintain America along the lines of the Republican Party, which is everything goes to the top? Hierarchical, top down, or do we want to reform America in the vision of, in a more progressive direction, frankly? So anyhow, here's FDR again.
Taxes, after all, are the dues that we pay for the privilege of membership in an organized society. And as society becomes more civilized, government, national and state and local, is called on to assume more obligations to its citizens.
Notice he is saying the opposite of the end of the era of big government. He's saying this is the beginning of the era of big government.
The privileges of membership in a civilized society have vastly increased in modern times. But I am afraid we have many who still do not recognize their advantages and want to avoid paying their dues.
Right. And those dues, of course, as he said, the price of membership in a civil society is taxes. Here he is again.
On the one hand, there has been a vast
Sorry.
of these benefits.
Let me just start this
On the one hand, there has been a vast majority of citizens who believe that the benefits of democracy should be extended and who are willing to pay their fair share to extend them. And on the other hand, there has been a small but powerful group which has fought the extension of these benefits because it did not want to pay a fair share of their cost.
Now, this is 1936. We are largely out of the Great Depression. I mean, unemployment is down to 12%. Unemployment was at the 1936 in the neighborhood. It was within 2 points of where it was in the second or third year of Reagan's presidency. This is FDR running for re-election. And this, so here we are testing the experiment. And by the way, when he I think he only lost 2 states in the 1936 election. I'm pretty sure it was New Hampshire and Maine in the 1936 election were the only 2 states he lost. He continues.
Taxes shall be levied according to ability to pay. That is the only American principle.
And Americans were saying, yes, finally somebody is saying. Now, keep in mind, for 10 years, Republicans have been saying, from 1921 until arguably until 32, Hoover was still campaigning on this, deregulate, cut taxes. That was the Republican mantra. And FDR is saying, nonsense.
We fought the World War, and it cost us $25 billion.
That's World War I.
In 3 years to win it. We borrowed to fight that war. A Democratic administration provided sufficient taxes to pay off the entire war debt within 10 or 15 years. Those taxes in the war days had been levied according to ability to pay. But the succeeding Republican administration did not believe in that principle, and there was a reason.
He's talking about the Warren Harding election in 1920, where Harding campaigned on a platform of lowering taxes, less government in business and more business in government, lowering taxes and deregulation.
They had political debt to those who sat at their elbows. To pay those political debts, they reduced the taxes of their friends in the higher brackets and left the national debt to be paid by later generations. Sound
familiar? Keep in mind, Reagan tripled the national debt. When George W. Bush came in, the national debt was $5 trillion. When he left, it was $10 trillion, and there was another $5 trillion in the pipeline from his 2 unpaid wars that weren't even in the budget. FDR again.
They got out from under then. They would get out from under now if their friends could get back into power and they could get back into the driver's seat. But neither you nor I think that they are going to get back.
So the applause is for raising taxes on rich people, right? You get this applause and it's not like class warfare. It's not like, oh, those horrible rich people. It's, we want an economy that works for everybody, not just the elites. It's a very straightforward principle. And this is my final FDR clip.
But you would think, to hear some people talk, that those good people who live at the top of our economic pyramid are being taxed into rags and tatter. But what is the fact? The fact is that they are much further away from the poorhouse than they were in 1932. And you and I know that as a matter of personal observation.
In other words, what he's saying here is, I not only saved the working class of America from the Great Depression, he's saying, I saved rich people from the Great Depression. And that's the point that I think has, there's actually, some conversations about this that suggest that, among wealthy people, and you see this with the patriotic millionaires, for example, Nick Hanauer's group, where you've got people who are, Nick Hanauer is actually a billionaire. And he's saying, raise my taxes. And part of why he's saying raise my taxes, and by the way, and let's have, a national healthcare system, and let's have free college, and let's, all these things. He's saying, let's do this stuff. And he's saying, let's do it, not because not because he's some great moral force, but because as a billionaire, he sees a country around him crumbling. And who wants to be a rich man in a poor country? Who wants to be a wealthy guy living in the third world? And so right now there is a battle underway, and it's largely a battle between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party for the heart and soul of America and for the future of America. Which direction do we go?
To watch more clips from our programs, hit the Watch More Videos button over here. And please be sure to hit the handy-dandy subscribe button so you'll always be up to date. Tag, you're it.